Thank you for joining us today. This presentation is one of several presentations that are being offered as part of Open Education Week. We invite you to attend the other presentations this week. You can see the link to our library news blog with links to other presentations in the chat. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the ISU Library's YouTube channel for future viewing. Following the presentation, we will have a question and answer period where you can unmute yourself and ask questions, or if you'd like to post a question in the chat, I can read your questions during the question and answer portion of the presentation. Our presenter can respond to those questions at that time. Let me introduce our speaker today. Dr. Joshua Swift is a professor in the psychology department at Idaho State University. He received his Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Oklahoma State University and has been a faculty member at ISU since 2015. Swift received an ISU OER stipend award and used this opportunity to develop OER materials for the Ethics and Professional Practice in Psychology course, Psych 4412-5512. This is a stacked course offered at both the graduate and advanced undergraduate levels, with students from both groups in the classroom together. This course is taught every spring semester and has been offered continuously by Swift for the past 10 years at ISU. And with that, I will introduce Dr. Swift. Thank you.
It occurs when it's just an undergrad level class only. It is a 2-credit course, so a little bit briefer in terms of time and expectation commitments for it compared to a regular 3-credit course. Now, the big focus of the course is on helping students learn the ethics code for the American Psychological Association. Within this ethics code for APA, there are general principles that serve as kind of aspirational markers for people who enter the profession. Things like beneficence and non-maleficence, things like justice and integrity, and so on. And then there's the second part of the ethics code that includes the specific standards that are enforceable rules of what to do or not do in particular situations. And I guess in thinking about those specific standards and rules, they cover things like clinical work, research, and teaching. Any area that a psychologist, a professional psychologist, might be engaged in. So an example of one of these principles is multiple relationships. And we just talked about that this last Monday in the class that I taught. And so under multiple relationships, there's questions that we explore in this class, like, is it okay for a therapist to start seeing a client who they also see every Sunday at church? Or is it okay for a faculty member to mentor a student on research projects if they used to be a psychotherapy client of theirs in the past? And so the ethics code really goes into a lot of these types of standards or rules really governing how we do clinical work, research, and teaching. So for this course in particular, I have kind of 2 main goals. One is I really want students to get to know the ethics code well. And it's not that big of a code, so I pretty much expect them to have it memorized almost by the end of the course. Now, I don't test them, have them sit down and spout it out right from the beginning, but really know what each of the standards are and be able to know what each means. But more importantly in this course, we focus a lot on ethical decision-making, so that when students are faced with a conflict, maybe a conflict between 2 parts of the ethics code, or a conflict between the ethics code and the law in a particular state, or even ethics code and organizational demand of the company that they work for, that they can still figure out what to do in those situations. Also recognizing that in many situations, professionals in the field will face conflicts that aren't even talked about in the ethics code or not even covered. And so by helping them learn some decision-making models and think more deeply about the principles, then it gives them guidance in their future situations when they encounter that. Big component of this course is class discussion. I really, in this course, do not do any PowerPoint presentations. I'm really not there to lecture on things, but most of what we do is just engage in talking about these principles and standards, and then these gray areas that they might have to face in the future. Now, given that the big portion is class discussion, the textbook is really important. They have to come prepared in order to engage in that discussion, having read ahead of time. It's not just one that you can show up and listen and learn, and then at some other time read the textbook and learn, but you have to be ready for the class periods. Now, there's been some problems with the existing textbooks that I've used for this class in the past, and I've never been too happy with any of them. And some of the problems are related to what I mentioned earlier about kind of concerns that I have with textbook publishers. But there are some problems in particular with the ethics textbooks that we've kind of that we have in the field that are often used for classes like this. So all of these ethics textbooks do cover the ethics code. That's standard, that they go through all those principles and standards and they're included. But students can access the ethics code for free anyway. That's available just by going to the APA website. So some of the problem with the textbooks is then what do they do beyond just restating the ethics code? And some of the textbooks, including the one that I used when I was a graduate student and I was learning about the ethics code, many of them are just too sensational. And what I mean by that is they state the standard and then they proceed to give examples of ethics code violations of those standards. But when they give these examples, they're often in the very extreme examples that no one would ever really have a question about. Now, of course, some people do engage in these behaviors, but everybody can recognize they're wrong. You don't need a textbook to tell you that. And one example I remember from when I was in graduate school was it told about a case example of a therapist who would have all of her clients dress up like babies and even have them wear diapers when they came in for their appointments with her. Okay, so we can all recognize that that's unethical, that's not appropriate. We don't need a textbook to just give us examples. And so I felt like when a book takes this type of approach, it's kind of just wasted time there. Now, other ethics textbooks that are out there, I felt are too basic. So they don't give these extreme examples, but pretty much all they do is just go over each and every standard and just give a basic explanation of what it means. These textbooks tend to be pretty dry because they're just repeating, what the standard is in other words. And so I feel like students can sometimes get bored with those ones. None of the textbooks really get into the gray areas or things that the ethics code maybe doesn't cover. And very few of them ever talk about a decision-making process for these types of complex areas that we face in the profession. Finally, with all of these textbooks, they are expensive, but they tend to be between $75 to up to $200, just depending on how new they are and the particular publisher. So anyway, so I was excited to try something new for this ethics class that I teach. So the first step that I took was to look for an existing OER textbook. And as I did that, I wasn't able to find anything out there. There were ethics books for other disciplines like business and public speaking and things like that that I was able to identify, but nothing specific for psychology. And the ones that were kind of related to psychology or the things that were popping up for psychology were really around research ethics. And they tended to just be chapters in textbooks on open education resource textbooks on research methods. They might then include a chapter just on research ethics. And so that really wasn't adequate at all for the variety of topics that we cover in the course. We typically in this course only spend maybe 2 weeks on research ethics. And so we needed something much broader. So as I realized that there weren't any existing OER complete textbooks out there for this topic area, then I decided to take an approach where I'd look for individual materials that really fit the topics that I wanted to teach. Now, I was already familiar with a lot of this topic area, a lot of these materials that are out there since I've been teaching the course for the past 10 years. But I really enjoyed this process of being able to go just week by week and look at the class that I wanted to teach and what I wanted to cover in each class discussion period, and then look for the materials that aligned with those particular topics. Now, as I identified these things, I started just making a big list of a bunch of different articles, a bunch of different resources for every single topic list. And then I looked at it and made sure that I was still, even though I organized it around the topics I wanted to teach, I made sure that I was still covering all of the essential elements of the ethics code too. So they got comprehensive coverage with it. Now, the types of materials that I was able to identify and include in this course are pretty varied. Many of the things that I included were journal articles. So some of these journal articles were just research studies examining a particular topic that we would usually talk about in the course. Some of these journal articles were professional opinion papers on what counts as a violation or when to take action on these things. For example, I have included a study where they surveyed therapists who have been out in practice for many years, and they gave the therapist case examples of an adolescent who reported something to their provider. And then the question was, is what they reported something where you'd have to break their confidentiality and tell their parents or tell somebody outside of the therapy room? And it's a really interesting article that we were then able to bring to get the students to think about, who's the actual client and what rights does an adolescent have to privacy, especially around things like if they report thoughts of suicide, underage drinking, drug use, sexual activity, things like that. Others of these research articles were studies showing positive effects of following the ethics code. For example, in this current setup, we have a meta-analysis that students read that shows that when therapists follow the ethics code around engaging in self-care behaviors, that they end up being more effective as therapists. And so really demonstrating that it's a good thing to follow the ethics code. Now, besides the journal articles, I also included several different professional articles that maybe weren't showing up in academic journals, but were showing up in other professional areas. So professional organization websites and bulletins or newsletters from professional organizations and so on. So these types of papers were primarily written by ethics experts sharing their opinions about what a particular standard actually means and how to handle some particularly difficult situations falling under that standard. So for example, what to do when a client expresses thoughts of suicide. And then in addition, I was able to include some guidelines that were published by professional organizations. So for example, the ethics code says that psychologists cannot engage in unfair discrimination against individuals based on a number of different identifying factors. But that's all it says about discrimination. APA, though, the American Psychological Association, has also published really thorough, extensive, and detailed guidelines for each of these areas. So say for working with culture, religion and spirituality, gender issues, and so on in psychotherapy. And so we were able to bring in a lot of these more nuanced guidelines that we have to give students better direction. And then there's also as an example, very specific guidelines say on the how to do responsible conduct of research that go far beyond the basic research standards in the ethics code that we can bring in. And then finally, some of the materials that I've included are just videos and online activities. So as I started the class, I teach about moral philosophies in general. And so now I was able to bring in some popular YouTube videos from a well-known philosophy professor online, rather than just sticking with the textbook, which doesn't even cover this area at all. And as another example, as we cover privacy and confidentiality in the class, I'm able to bring in the city training on those topics and have students engage in that more. Okay, so last step then of this process was for me to make it reasonable. There is so much good stuff out there that I had to take my big list and really narrow it down to reading expectations at the right level for the students and for the class. Now, from this process, there were a number of positive effects. One is, of course, the cheaper cost for the students. Like I said, that's an additional maybe month of food that they can get now that they didn't buy that textbook. But more importantly, I really enjoyed being able to tailor the text that I found to what I wanted to focus on and cover in the course. And that made the course development this year more fun and engaging to me than it has ever been in the past. So instead of just me taking the textbook and say, okay, what do we have to talk about this week? That's in chapter 1 of the textbook. I was able to figure first out what I wanted to talk about each week and then find materials associated with those topics. And as a result, I feel like it has, I guess, been a more valuable and rewarding learning experience for the students as well, because they're able to focus more in depth on learning the topic areas that are most critical for them as they continue with their future education and careers. So it's been a great process, and I'm looking forward to continuing on with it with others of my courses as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swift. That was really an engaging discussion and presentation. I have some questions, but I'm going to open it up to Jenny and Spencer. Thank you for joining us, Jenny. First, if other people have questions, but I definitely have some questions for our presenters.
I guess I can ask a question. Jenny, did you have a question?
Not yet.
So did you get feedback from your students? Did they express any gratitude for the cost of the materials, or did they talk about how interesting they were, or did they notice that
Yeah.
these were ones that you taught, that you chose?
That's a good question. So we're just partway through the semester now, and I haven't asked them that yet. So nobody's come forward and said a big thank you, from the outset of the class. But I am looking forward to, on our course evaluations and stuff, we do have questions specific about the materials. So I'm looking forward to seeing how, those rate compared to other years. And then I do plan at the end of the semester, I always in all my classes ask them for feedback in the final class period where we do talk about things like the textbook. So excited to hear from them, but nothing so far.
Okay, thank you.
Following on that, could you ask if they did the textbook bundle?
Yes.
Because aren't they bundling the OER and then charging for that?
Yes. Yeah. That's been some question that's come up in multiple classes. So I'm also the department chair for psychology right now. And this is something that I've heard across classes, faculty members, students, just kind of a little bit of confusion about like, well, what direction are we moving with this? And I recognize that both in place at the same time, OER and the book bundle can indeed still save students money, but it is a little confusing sometimes to students about and faculty, which one should we kind of be pursuing, here with it. And so we've just tried to been really open with students and letting them know that the book bundle is optional, that for some students, depending on what classes you have, the book bundle is going to save you a lot. And for other students, depending on what classes you have, it might not save you anything. It might be more expensive to do it. So just really encouraging our students to look closely and calculate it out for their individual situation.
Mm.
It would be interesting to know when you talk to your students, how many of them chose the book bundle versus the non-book bundle, and then follow up with the question of how much did the bookstore charge for your course to be part of the book bundle? Because
Yep.
and that leads to more information that can help us make those decisions on whether we're moving or not to.
Right. Right. Yep, definitely.
And just as you were ending, you were saying you're thinking of doing more OER with your other courses.
Yep. Yeah. So I right now I also teach a self-care and well-being course. Now the textbook that we use for that course is actually my textbook that I've written. But it's a cheaper one, at least for students. They can get it online for just $10. So better, but yeah, I recognize there still is a cost for that. But I do have two other courses that I frequently teach. One is undergraduate psychopathology course. And that's one where the textbook is pretty expensive, and the publishers do update that textbook frequently. So students can't, buy these older copies of it. And so there's that one. And then I have one other graduate course that I often teach, supervision and consultation. Smaller number of students in that course, but again, the textbook is pretty expensive. And so I've been considering which one of those to address next with open education resources.
Wonderful.
So you like that it promotes discussion and
Right.
engagement for both of you and them.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
Very good. Speaking of discussion, I'm curious if you've noticed an increase or has it stayed the same in their quality of work in the course?
Right. Right. I think that's a good question. So I do feel like the students in this class are particularly engaged. I haven't, I guess, taken the step back to evaluate if it's due to the different textbook options or not. But one thing that I clearly have noticed is students, when they engage in the discussion in the class, they're more often referencing the readings that they did. Whereas before, they might not have ever brought up something from the actual textbook, but now it is coming into play more. Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, I really like your engagement with the material. You seem really excited about it, which obviously is going to lean forward into their work, which is a scholarship conversation as well,
Right.
which is really interesting about education and academia, which is going to, I'm just, obviously that's not a question, but that's part of being in school, and that's going to trickle down to them. So,
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, if it's not in the traditional textbook and you're wanting them to be in that gray area and learn these concepts, if I were going into this field, I would really benefit from that. I really liked listening to this discussion because I'm not in this field. And of course, I mean, if I were going into this field, I would be, yeah, I would want to know that, right?
Yep.
Because I don't want to just know it from the black and white. I want to be like, what are the hard things?
Right. Yep. Definitely. And not just the ridiculous things either that
Yes.
other textbooks
Yeah,
cover.
yeah.